On a crisp March morning in 1943, Colonel Frank Eldridge stood before a massive jigsaw puzzle mounted on the wall of the Chicago Signal Depot, with bond clerk Marge Henning bearing witness to the ceremony. With deliberate care, he removed the first piece from the puzzle, a symbolic gesture that would be repeated with each war bond purchased. Beneath the mosaic lay concealed a painting of a warship that bore the proud name of their city, a vessel that had met its fate in the waters near Guadalcanal just 2 months prior. The festivities of that day, designated as Avenge the Chicago Day, marked the 15th day of an ambitious 40-day campaign to raise $40 million in war bonds. The money would fund the construction of a new warship to carry the city's name once more, replacing the one that now rested at the bottom of the Pacific. The cruiser depicted beneath that puzzle, along with her valiant crew, had left behind a legacy of courage that Chicago would not soon forget. The original Chicago had first touched water at the Mare Island Navy Yard on April 10, 1930, sliding down the ways as the fourth ship of the Northampton class. Designated with hull number C-29, she embodied the typical design philosophy of American heavy cruisers built between the wars. At launch, she displaced 9,300 tons and carried a peacetime complement of approximately 750 souls. Her main armament consisted of 9 8-inch guns arranged in 3 turrets, supplemented by 4 single-mounted 5-inch guns. As the clouds of war gathered, an assortment of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns were added to her arsenal. The morning that changed everything found the Chicago some 420 miles southeast of Midway Island on December 7, 1941, serving as escort to the aircraft carrier Lexington on a mission to deliver planes to the island's airfield. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack crackled over the radio, the task force immediately commenced a search for the Japanese attack force, though their efforts proved fruitless. The war had begun, and the Chicago would soon find herself in the thick of it. Throughout 1942, the cruiser proved her mettle in the crucible of combat. In May, she engaged Japanese aircraft during the Battle of the Coral Sea and participated in anti-submarine operations near Sydney, Australia. When American forces launched their invasion of Guadalcanal in August, the Chicago was there, her guns blazing at Japanese planes on the 7th and 8th. But on August 9th, during the Battle of Savo Island, a Japanese torpedo tore into her bow, forcing her to return to the west coast for extensive repairs. By early January 1943, having been patched up and refitted, she sailed out of San Francisco, heading once more toward the crucible of the South Pacific. January 1943 marked the 5th month of brutal fighting on Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive in the Pacific theater, still grinding on without resolution. American forces controlled much of the island, yet the Japanese showed no inclination to withdraw. Admiral Ernest King, serving as chief of naval operations, grew increasingly impatient with the stalemate. In his words, it seemed they were merely continuing to swap punches with the enemy, albeit to their advantage, but without working toward any discernible plan. King wanted the Lower Solomons secured and the offensive to press forward. In late January, aerial reconnaissance brought troubling news of major Japanese fleet units operating near Ontong Java Atoll, north of Guadalcanal. Additional reports indicated heightened activity at Rabaul, the major air-sea base on New Britain to the northwest. The signs pointed toward a significant Japanese naval operation in the making. Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, who had assumed command of the South Pacific area in October, decided to meet the threat head-on. To cover a convoy of 4 troop transports loaded with Marines and supplies bound for Guadalcanal, he deployed a vast array of naval power. 6 task forces assembled northeast of Australia, hoping to lure the Japanese into a major engagement. The new battleships North Carolina, Washington, and Indiana would participate, alongside the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, the latter 2 serving as the lead ships of Task Forces 11 and 16 respectively. Traveling behind the forward task forces, these powerful groups stood ready to engage any heavy Japanese fleet units that might venture south. All task force commanders carried orders to destroy any Japanese forces encountered during their northward movement. Leading the sortie on January 27th were 2 task groups, including the troop convoy built around the transports President Adams, President Hayes, President Jackson, and Crescent City departing from New Caledonia. Task Force 18, designated as the Close Support Group, consisted of 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 escort carriers. Under the command of Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, who had recently arrived from the Atlantic aboard his flagship, the cruiser Wichita, the force departed from a fate in the New Hebrides. Giffen, a 1907 graduate of the Naval Academy who had commanded a destroyer in the First World War, had most recently led Task Group 34.1 during the Allied invasion of North Africa. Giffen's orders directed him to rendezvous with Destroyer Squadron 21, which had been operating near Guadalcanal, and sweep to the northwest of the island while the transports unloaded their precious cargo. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the evening on January 30th, off the southwest coast of Guadalcanal. On January 29th, Giffen received ominous warnings of possible Japanese intentions, specifically mentioning several submarines thought to be prowling the area and a large number of enemy aircraft spotted around Guadalcanal. The communications also carried warnings of a possible night air attack. To increase his task force's speed northward, Giffen made the fateful decision at 3 in the afternoon on January 29th to detach the escort carriers Chenango and Suwannee along with 2 destroyers. The carriers continued providing fighter cover for Task Force 18 during daylight hours as they moved southeast, while the remaining ships, freed from the constraints of the carriers' slower speed, pressed north at 24 knots to keep their appointed rendezvous. Task Force 18 now comprised the heavy cruisers Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, the light cruisers Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia, and 6 destroyers. Drawing on his Atlantic experience, Giffen organized his formation with submarine threats foremost in mind. He divided his cruisers into 2 columns, with light cruisers on the left and heavy cruisers on the right. The 6 destroyers formed a half-circle screen ahead of the columns. While this arrangement provided excellent anti-submarine protection and allowed for quick movement into surface battle positions, it left the rear areas more vulnerable to air attack. Critically, Giffen issued no specific orders to his ships regarding how to respond to an air assault. As evening fell on January 29th, Task Force 18 zigzagged on a base course of 305 degrees, moving northwest toward the rendezvous point at 24 knots. With darkness approaching, the fighter cover had departed for the night. The force had passed north of Rennell Island and was approximately 35 miles from Guadalcanal. The Chicago steamed second in line behind the Wichita in the right column of heavy cruisers, with her sister ship Louisville following immediately behind. Captain Ralph Davis, 52 years old, commanded the Chicago. The ship ran darkened, conducting radar searches with all anti-aircraft batteries manned and ready. The sun had set, and the task force now moved through the gathering twilight, that dangerous time when visibility favored the hunter over the hunted. At 10 minutes past 7, the Chicago CA-29 radar made contact with unidentified planes 25 miles to the west. The planes were making a wide circle, approaching the rear of the task force. Reports over the TBS radio from the Wichita confirmed what the radar operators suspected. These were enemy planes. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Giffen studied the radar plot, later describing it as looking like a disturbed hornet's nest. By 20 past 7, the enemy planes had divided into 2 groups and were closing on the task force from behind the starboard beam, a position that silhouetted the American ships against the twilight glow. The groups were closing at ranges of 10,000 and 17,000 yards. Captain Davis ordered his ship to general quarters, and the ringing alarm sent the crew racing to their battle stations. The approaching aircraft were Mitsubishi G4M Type 97 bombers, known to the Allies as Bettys. These twin-engine land-based bombers boasted a remarkable range of almost 3,700 miles. Harold Beckman, a cook aboard the Chicago, watched from his station on the well deck as the Japanese planes came in for their attack. What he witnessed seemed like a suicide assault. Enemy Zero fighters came first, machine gunning the decks in an attempt to drive men from their stations, followed by the torpedo planes diving at them. Some of the attackers fell in flames along the Chicago's port side, their kamikaze-like approach leaving them no means to turn back. The fast-moving Bettys began their torpedo runs low and fast, approaching the heavy cruiser column from the unprotected starboard stern quarter. At approximately 25 past 7, the destroyer Waller, positioned immediately to starboard of the Chicago, opened fire on the first group of approaching planes. The Chicago's starboard 5-inch and 40mm batteries quickly joined the barrage, the former under full radar control. Approximately 12 minutes had elapsed since the initial radar contact. The Chicago carried a deadly secret: new proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. Used in conjunction with fragmentation shells, these revolutionary weapons contained a radio transceiver that caused the shell to explode when near a target. The innovation meant that a near miss could be almost as effective as a direct hit when firing at enemy planes. Two bombers approached the Chicago from the after section of the starboard beam. At least one torpedo splashed into the water 500 or 600 yards out, though no wake was visible. Both planes passed ahead of the Chicago, apparently undamaged by the heavy barrage. Another plane launched a torpedo at the Louisville, which avoided being hit only through a sharp turn to port. Tracers illuminated the darkening sky as all ships of the task force fired at the attacking planes. One Betty exploded in flames and hit the sea close behind the Chicago. The Japanese planes swept past the cruisers and retired off the port bow of the task force. The first attack ended with no ships reporting damage. Focused intently on making the appointed rendezvous, Giffen continued at the same speed on the same base course, discontinuing the zigzag pattern to make up for lost time. Then suddenly, flares began appearing on both sides of the task force. White parachute flares dangled in the sky while red flares glowed on the ocean surface below. Dropped by Japanese scout planes, both types served to illuminate the ships against the now dark sky. The Japanese aircraft now had a beacon leading them directly to the American ships. Shortly after 7:30, more bombers appeared from the eastern sky. One Betty launched a torpedo ahead of the Chicago that passed harmlessly through the cruiser's wake. At least one torpedo was thought to have passed near the Wichita, and a second hit the Louisville, but failed to detonate. Standing tall against the background of the flares, the right column of heavy cruisers continued to bear the brunt of the air attack, with more planes closing at approximately 7:38. One bomber went down in flames directly behind the destroyer Waller. A second was hit and caught fire, burning brightly as it passed near the Chicago, lighting up the deck with burning fuel before crashing into the sea off the port bow. Lieutenant Edward Jarman, serving as the Chicago's air defense officer, would never forget that near miss. They had filled one torpedo plane so full of steel that it nearly exploded on the Chicago itself, missing their boat by only 10 feet. The plane burned for 3 or 4 minutes, silhouetting them perfectly for the second wave of attackers. Fed by aviation fuel, the wreckage burned with intense brightness, illuminating the cruiser and making her an easy target for other approaching planes. The Japanese pilots concentrated on the Chicago, apparently mistaking her for a battleship. At 7:40, a torpedo struck the after engine room on the starboard side of the Chicago with a thunderous explosion. Radio technician John Irby was near the point of impact. He had been in the starboard passageway when the first torpedo struck, not 30 feet away from him. Shortly after the torpedo hit, communications failed, and they had to evacuate the passageway. He joined others trying desperately to put out fires and save the ship. 2 minutes later, a torpedo wake was sighted closing in fast. Almost immediately, a second torpedo exploded against the starboard side, hitting near the No. 3 fire room and forward engine room. The first hit brought immediate consequences. Propeller shafts 1, 2, and 3 stopped. Control of the ship was lost as the rudder locked at 10 degrees to the left and no longer responded to commands from the bridge. 4 compartments, including the after engine room and the No. 4 fire room, flooded rapidly. Water began slowly entering the crew's mess. The Chicago, now listing to starboard, began settling by the stern. Emergency diesel generators were started to provide power for lighting, electrical fire pumps, submersible pumps, and radios. The second torpedo flooded the No. 3 fire room and forward engine room. The machine shop was demolished and several small fires broke out. The starboard list gradually increased to 11 degrees. Soon afterward, the No. 4 propeller shaft stopped, leaving the Chicago dead in the water. The Louisville turned sharply to avoid hitting her stalled sister ship before taking up position behind the Wichita. Admiral Giffen received a notification by TBS that the Chicago had been torpedoed and disabled. Now under the cover of darkness, he took steps to protect the remaining ships from further air attacks. Giffen changed course to 120 degrees and slowed the task force. The reduced speed made it difficult for Japanese pilots to spot the white wakes behind the ships. Anti-aircraft fire was prohibited unless directed at a definite target. Unable to get a good fix on the American ships, the remaining Japanese planes headed home. Aboard the Chicago, damage control parties sprang into action immediately in a determined effort to save the ship. The crew was not only well-trained, but also battle-tested, having dealt with torpedo damage at the Battle of Savo Island. As at Savo, all hands were determined to save their ship. Fires and flooding demanded immediate attention. Small fires in the galley and radio room too were quickly extinguished by damage control parties. Bulkheads were shored up to prevent further flooding. Albert Bartholomew, the ship's carpenter, led a damage control party deep into the ship to close critical hatches. His party worked like dogs to keep us afloat, he later recalled. They swam 30 feet in water chin deep, dodging heavy tables and chairs as the ship rolled to secure hatches. Leaks in the laundry and ice machine rooms were quickly plugged. Flooding boundaries were established, allowing bucket brigades to begin their work. Engineers began working on the jammed rudder, which was straightened out shortly after midnight. The key to saving the crippled Chicago lay in getting her out of range of land-based Japanese bombers. Shortly after midnight, preparations began for the Chicago to be taken under tow by the Louisville. Under the command of Captain Charles Joy, the Louisville maneuvered into position with its stern about 1,000 yards off the bow of the Chicago. After resolving some initial problems encountered while trying to position the cruisers close together in the darkness, sailors began the arduous task of connecting the two ships with a thick steel chain. Captain Joy would later comment that the passing of the tow was accomplished without a hitch and exactly as planned, with no injury to personnel or damage to material. Once attached, the Louisville moved ahead slowly at 4 knots, bound for Espiritu Santo. 3 destroyers accompanied the connected cruisers on their slow journey south. The remaining ships of Task Force 18 headed west to screen against any possible Japanese ship movements. Help was also coming from other sources. Admiral Halsey ordered Task Force 16 to move toward the stricken cruiser. Under the command of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, the task force was approximately 350 miles south of the Chicago. Built around the carrier Enterprise, the force headed north at 28 knots. Sherman was directed to provide fighter air cover over the Chicago during daylight hours. To accomplish this, he had to position the Enterprise precariously, close enough to the cruiser to allow for a short flight time for his fighters, yet far enough away that Japanese planes sent to attack the Chicago would not be in a position to sight the Enterprise. Additional fighter protection would be provided by the escort carriers if needed. The fleet tug Navajo and the destroyer Sands were also dispatched to assist in the rescue mission. Meanwhile, frantic work continued aboard the Chicago. The No. 2 mess hall, after engine room, forward engine room, and machine shop were open to the sea as a result of the twisted metal from the torpedo hits. However, most leaks in other compartments were plugged, and great progress was being made to remove water from flooded areas. Attention now turned to correcting the starboard list. Shortly after midnight, boiler No. 4 was restarted to provide additional power to the ship. Booster pumps were now able to correct the list by shifting fuel oil. As a precautionary measure, the captain ordered that most of the life rafts and floater nets be cut loose and placed on the deck. The prognosis for the Chicago now seemed to be improving. They were settling fast, and it had looked touch and go whether they would sink, Lieutenant Jarman recalled. The next morning, they were taking on more water than the book said they could and remain afloat. But they kept her up. Perhaps the cruiser would live to fight another day. It was just before 6 in the morning on January 30th when 4 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers lifted off the flight deck of the Enterprise. Disappearing into the pre-dawn sky, their mission was to visually locate the Chicago. At 15 past 7, the damaged cruiser was sighted approximately 35 miles east of Rennell Island. By 8 o'clock, 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters of Fighter Squadron 10 were on station overhead, with 4 other fighters circling above the Enterprise. The tug Navajo arrived shortly after 8 to relieve the Louisville of towing duties. In the early afternoon, Admiral Giffen signaled the Chicago, suggesting that a destroyer come alongside to transfer off any unnecessary personnel at Captain Davis's discretion. Davis signaled back, asking if the destroyer could also transfer his wounded men to a land hospital. Giffen replied that no destroyer could leave the task force due to the continued submarine threat. Davis decided to keep the crew aboard and prepared to defend the ship against another air attack, which seemed all but certain. Later in the day, Halsey ordered the remaining undamaged cruisers of Task Force 18 to head for port. At 3 in the afternoon, Admiral Giffen wished the Chicago good luck and headed south toward a fate. Leaving with the cruisers was the task force's fighter direction officer aboard the Wichita. As a result, there would be no on-site command and control for the fighters assigned to protect the Chicago. Screened by 6 destroyers, the cruiser continued south at 4 knots under tow by the Navajo. As each hour passed, the Chicago slowly limped farther away from the danger of Japanese bombers. The Japanese seemed determined not to let the crippled cruiser escape. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, Wildcat fighters above the Enterprise chased off a Japanese spotter plane sighted about 20 miles west of the carrier. The plane likely reported the positions of both the carrier and the crippled cruiser. By mid-afternoon, coast watchers had spotted a flight of Japanese aircraft south of New Georgia heading for Rennell Island. Shortly afterward, a warning message from Guadalcanal was picked up by the Enterprise. The fighter direction team aboard the carrier quickly estimated that the bombers would arrive in the area at approximately 4 o'clock. The Enterprise was now about 43 miles southeast of the Chicago. 10 Wildcat fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander William Kane, were on patrol above the cruiser. At 3:40, fighters over the Chicago sighted a single Japanese plane north of Rennell Island approaching at high altitude. The plane was likely a spotter, sent in advance to guide the main attack formation to the target. Kane dispatched 4 Wildcats to give chase. The Japanese plane turned south and headed around the eastern end of Rennell Island, putting it in a position to see both the Enterprise and the Chicago. The Wildcats gave chase, speeding at full throttle toward the twin-engine Betty. A well-placed burst of machine gun fire knocked out the starboard engine on the Japanese plane, which began to slow and trail smoke. Ensign Hank Leder pulled his Wildcat in for the kill. Soon the enemy aircraft caught fire, turned into a ball of flames, and spiraled toward the sea. The chase had carried the 4 fighters nearly 40 miles away from the Chicago and out of position to deal with the main enemy formation that was now approaching. At 4:06, radar aboard the Enterprise picked up an incoming flight of 12 Japanese bombers 67 miles away and bearing 300 degrees. The course had the bombers heading directly toward the Enterprise. The carrier increased speed as nearby ships closed to form a protective shield. Anti-aircraft guns were aimed skyward as the radar plot showed the enemy planes moving closer at 8,000 feet with their noses low, readying for torpedo runs. 10 additional fighters prepared to take off to meet the attackers. Kane had landed to refuel, and the 6 fighters still over the Chicago were now under the command of Lieutenant Mac Gregor Kilpatrick. The fighter direction team aboard the Enterprise directed Kilpatrick's 6 fighters away from the Chicago into a position to intercept the bombers heading for the carrier. Kilpatrick and his wingmen separated from the remaining 4 fighters as the Wildcats moved into position to meet the oncoming attackers. The Japanese bombers, then 17 miles from the carrier, suddenly made a sharp turn away from the Enterprise and headed directly for the Chicago. Kilpatrick would later recall how they dropped down to attack. But the Japanese commander saw their Wildcat fighter planes and realized he could not get across the miles separating him from the task force. So he took what seemed to be the easy way out. The torpedo planes turned sharply and headed west toward the Chicago. Kilpatrick's 4 Wildcats, which a moment earlier had stood ready to intercept the incoming bombers before they reached the Enterprise, were now behind the enemy planes and giving chase. The 10 fighters that had lifted off the carrier were too far away to play a role in the impending air battle, as were fighters from the escort carriers that had separated from Task Force 18 a day earlier. Only Kilpatrick and his wingman, Bob Porter, were in position to intercept the bombers before they reached the Chicago. Both Wildcats turned sharply and dove in for the attack, riddling 2 Bettys with machine gun fire on the first pass. Before the Japanese had come completely around, Kilpatrick recalled, 2 of their number were spinning down with dead pilots at the controls. The remaining torpedo bombers pressed home their attack. The battle that followed was a short but frenzied event that took place at high speed in close proximity to the stricken cruiser. With the CXAM radar out of commission from damage sustained in the first torpedo attack, the incoming bombers were sighted by a lookout on the Chicago at a distance of 7 miles. 11 bombers were counted speeding in low and fast from the starboard side. Directly between the Chicago and the approaching planes stood the destroyer La Valette, which trained all available guns skyward and opened fire. 2 minutes after the initial contact, The starboard 5-inch battery of the Chicago joined in at an initial range of 8,000 yards, firing the first of what would be 49 rounds of ammunition expended in the battle. The smaller 40mm and 20mm guns opened fire as range allowed. The crews of both ships fought desperately to shoot down the enemy planes before they could launch their deadly torpedoes. Marine Sergeant Anthony Anderson aboard the Chicago recalled how his men kept fighting in the face of both wounds and great danger. Private William Stander continued firing despite 2 bullets in his back until Anderson took him out of his harness and got in himself to keep his gun firing. Private Harold Dixon stayed at his post until he collapsed. Private Verona Brown, with a shrapnel wound in his right leg, got down on one knee and kept loading. Sustaining a bullet wound to the thigh, Brown survived and was later evacuated from the ship on a stretcher. At least 2 Japanese planes fell into the water off the starboard side of the Chicago. A third Betty approached as if to crash into the cruiser. With one engine on fire, the plane sped toward the cruiser as anti-aircraft gunners tried to shoot it down. The flaming plane missed the stern of the ship and hit the water off the port quarter. By this time, the 4 diverted fighters, initially from the Enterprise, caught up to the Japanese bombers. They'd joined Kilpatrick and Porter, following the Japanese bombers into the field of anti-aircraft fire being put up by the Chicago and the La Valette. Incredibly, not one of the Wildcats was damaged as they followed the bombers right over the Chicago, sending 2 more Japanese planes down in flames. The anti-aircraft fire subsided as the remaining enemy aircraft passed, with the Wildcat fighters in hot pursuit. Moments after the bombers had passed, 5 torpedo wakes were sighted approaching the Chicago from the starboard beam. Under a tow that was making only 3 knots, the cruiser was in no position to take evasive action. The first torpedo hit well forward at 4:24, showering the forecastle and bridge with water and debris. Only seconds later, 3 more torpedoes exploded in rapid succession, some hitting near the already damaged engineering and engine rooms. The 5th torpedo passed off to the stern. Standing between the attacking bombers and the Chicago, the La Valette was hit by a single torpedo on the port side. 22 crewmen, including damage control and engineering officer Lieutenant Eli Roth, were killed in the blast. The explosion flooded the forward engine and boiler rooms almost immediately, with the water soon spreading to the after boiler room. Quick action by damage control parties managed to contain the flooding. The La Valette survived the ordeal and was eventually towed to port. The Chicago would not be so fortunate. It soon became apparent that the Chicago was in serious trouble. After the torpedoes hit, the list to starboard increased at a rapid pace as water poured in. With the situation hopeless, Captain Davis gave the order to abandon ship. Life rafts were thrown overboard, with some difficulty on the port side due to the increasing list. Crewmen aboard the Navajo worked to cut the tow line. As the crew began to leave the ship, another battle was being waged below. Crewmen in the sick bay, many wounded in the first attack, were now becoming trapped in the flooding compartment. Lieutenant Jarman commented on the bravery of the ship's doctor, Lieutenant Everett Jones, who carried out a spinal meningitis case and then tried to rescue another patient. But he could not go back down because of the inrushing water. Jarman recalled an orderly evacuation. They got off every survivor on rafts, he remembered. They had nearly 300 recruits, but all were orderly and waited for orders. There was no panic. The Chicago rolled over to starboard and began to sink stern first with colors flying. She laid over on her starboard side and went down fast but smooth, Jarman said. She fired a 5-inch salute to herself as she went down, shells exploding from the heat of the torpedo fires. Irby watched the ship go down while floating in the water. It was like watching someone he had known and loved go down under the waves, he recalled. All the men floating in the water cheered. At 4:43, 19 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the bow disappeared below the surface. The proud cruiser Chicago was now only a memory. The destroyers Waller, Edwards, and Sands joined the Navajo in rescuing the crew of the Chicago. Planes and ships continued to search the area until all survivors were believed to be recovered. Of the 1,130 officers and men aboard ship at the time of the attacks, 1,069 were rescued. In his official action report, Captain Davis praised his crew for their excellent and fearless work in keeping the ship afloat after the first action, and for their courageous and orderly conduct in abandoning ship when she was sinking. The Battle of Rennell Island was over. For their part, the Japanese claimed to have won a decisive victory. On February 1st, Radio Tokyo reported that Japanese naval air forces had sunk 3 battleships and 2 cruisers in 2 days of air attacks south of Guadalcanal. The report seemed to specifically reference the attack on the Chicago, the only accurate part of the communique. A cruiser which had escaped unscathed on the previous night was also subjected to intensive torpedo attacks, the propaganda report claimed. After several hits had been scored on her, she sank with a loud explosion. The U.S. Navy reported downing a total of 17 Japanese torpedo planes during the same time frame. With the Japanese focused on attacking and sinking the Chicago, the 4 American transports arrived and departed Guadalcanal without incident. As it was later learned, the Japanese fleet was preparing to cover the evacuation of Imperial troops from Guadalcanal. Japanese destroyers began to remove troops from the island during the night of February 1st, a process that continued for the next 7 days. On the morning of February 9th, American ground forces completed their push to the western tip of the island. On the same day, their commander reported by radio that total and complete defeat of Japanese forces had been effected at 4:25 that day. The long and bloody struggle for Guadalcanal was over. The loss of the Chicago could be traced to a variety of contributing factors. Chief among them was Admiral Giffen's complete focus on making the appointed rendezvous time with the destroyers near Guadalcanal at the expense of other considerations. His inexperience with battle conditions in the Pacific led him to arrange Task Force 18 in a formation that was not suitable for air defense. A variety of problems, poor judgments, and just plain bad luck allowed Japanese bombers to press home and attack against the crippled Chicago while she was under the fighter protection of aircraft carriers. For the Japanese, sinking the Chicago was an endorsement of the new tactic of night torpedo attacks. The new Chicago, another heavy cruiser, was launched on August 20, 1944. Sunny skies and a cool breeze greeted the crowd that had assembled along the Delaware River at the Philadelphia Navy Yard for the event. The day also marked the launching of 2 other Navy warships, the carrier Antietam and the heavy cruiser Los Angeles. Mrs. E.J. Kelly, wife of Chicago's mayor, followed protocol as she broke the customary bottle of champagne against the new cruiser's hull, proclaiming, "In the name of the United States, I christen thee Chicago." In the day's keynote address, Undersecretary of the Navy Ralph Ibard told the crowd that the ships they launched that day had a dual mission, serving as instruments of war and peace alike. Speaking specifically about the new Chicago, he told the crowd that it was the second Chicago that captured their imagination. Although seeming distant at the moment, the last battle of the previous Chicago would not soon be forgotten. The memory of her final stand near Rennell Island and the courage of her crew would live on in the steel of her successor.